And Pope Francis provides that it's the responsibility of all of us, not just states, to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants, as Cardinal Baggio was talking about. The freedom to migrate and to remain lifts up the longstanding Catholic teaching that states have a responsibility to create the conditions that would allow persons to thrive in their home communities. It refers to these conditions, or the sum total of these conditions is the common good. And the common good includes, but it goes beyond, respect for rights and extending rights. As David Hollenbach, who's sitting in row 2 here, writes, he's written a beautiful book on this, these goods are common in the sense that they should be accessible and shared by all members of a community. And as a result, yet states often fail to meet this responsibility for good reasons and for bad sometimes. And as a result, many millions, all of them individuals, are compelled to leave their homes every year, often at great cost, sacrifice, and peril, as Cardinal Baggio also pointed out. Second, the freedom to stay or migrate reminds us of a basic truth, which is this: the right to migrate is extraordinarily important. To migrate is extraordinarily important. Consider the people who aren't free to migrate: genocide victims, slaves, trafficked persons, political prisoners, the starving, the indigent, the imprisoned, the detained, the kidnapped, persons in situations of protracted displacement, and others. They can't migrate easily, if at all. By contrast, most of the rest of us can migrate legally, more or less at our convenience, although we don't need to migrate in the way that forcibly displaced persons do. Third, the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, which is akin to the secular notion of devolution, informs the teaching on freedom to remain and migrate. And subsidiarity holds that consequential decisions and actions should be taken by those who are closest to them and who have the greatest stake in them and who are the most competent as a result to make them. In this case, forced migrants and their families are in the best situation to understand their own typically wrenching situations and to decide the best course to take. And fourth, the idea of the freedom to stay and migrate lifts up the God-given dignity and agency of displaced persons and forced migrants based on their deeper identity, and all of our deeper identity is God's children. It teaches that refugees and other forcibly displaced persons enjoy rights and freedoms like anyone else. Moreover, Catholic teaching invariably weds freedom with rights and responsibilities. Freedom to migrate and to stay is freedom to pursue a good life, either at home or elsewhere, a life consonant with human dignity in all its dimensions. So the Journal on Migration and Human Security has published a special edition that examines this teaching in different national and migration contexts. I wanted to thank Tom Hare and S.T.L Rivero, who are my co-editors of this volume and who themselves published a very powerful paper on the issue of rootedness, that is, taking Honduras as their particular case study. And rootedness refers to the conditions that allow or lead people to stay in their home countries when similarly situated people are leaving them. I'd also like to acknowledge two authors of the papers in this collection who joined us today. Cardinal Fabio Baggio is one of the authors, so please look for his paper. And Juan Sebastian Chamorro, who will speak next, is another of the authors. Let me introduce our speakers today, other authors, in the order that they'll speak. Antonio Lemos is a Brazilian moral theologian and Christian ethicist. He will be speaking on the theological themes that underlie Catholic teaching on the right to stay and migrate. Kevin Appleby is a senior fellow for policy and communications at the Center for Migration Studies. He's written on the extent to which the US and Europe have lived up to their commitments, upholding the rights to stay and migrate under the global compacts. Maria Prada Ramirez is a former permanent advisor to the president of the Colombian Truth, Reconciliation, and Non-Repetition Commission. Maria and Emma Murphy have examined the right to stay from the perspective of Colombia, which is trying to preserve a fragile peace, is hosting record numbers of Venezuelans, and has a very large internally displaced population as well. Michael Petro directs the Migrant Center Project at JRS Lebanon, and he wrote about the complex and dynamic situation in Lebanon, which is host to migrant laborers, Syrian refugees, natives who feel displaced by all of the above and would like to migrate. This reality, of course, has become far more complex since he wrote his paper. So how does the right to stay and migrate speak to these diverse realities? Each speaker will talk for 10 to 12 minutes, and that will leave some time at the end for questions. So let's start with Antonio.
Thank you, Don. Can you hear me well?
We can. Thank you.
Good. In this presentation, I want to briefly touch on two moments of the history of the right to stay and the right to migrate in Catholic social teaching. So my research is mainly focused on like what theology and faith can teach us about the right to stay and the right to migrate, and also in the history of Catholic theology, Catholic intellectual tradition, what instances we can find of theologians speaking in favor of the care for migrants. So first, I will discuss here some early reference to these rights in pre-modern Catholic theology. Then I will address the development of the right to migrate and stay in 20th century Catholic social teaching. So there is a long tradition in Christian theology and legal thought on caring for migrants. The most ancient instances of the church teaching on migration outside the biblical text are the teachings of the church fathers on poverty and wealth. A more direct reference to migration can be found in the letters of Saint Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century, so very early. In a letter to a Christian community, he said, quote, "If the church over there is unable to provide the afflicted with nourishment, they can move them to us in order that they may receive food and clothing here." End of quote. In another letter, Cyprian writes that, quote, "Please take diligent care of the infirm and all the poor. And if some of the travelers should be in need, you may obtain what you need from my personal funds. Out of fear that they might have been fully spent already, I have sent another sum in order that the effort for the suffering might take place with greater generosity as well as more promptly." End of quote. Later, other church fathers argued for the theological principle of the universal destination of goods, meaning that God created the earth for the flourishing of all human beings, independent of nationality, religion, and race. This is a principle that will be very often found in Catholic social teaching on migration in the 16th century and later on in modern times in the 20th century. This principle is drawn from a theology of creation developed by the church fathers in the 4th century, such as St. Ambrose, St. Basil, and St. Chrysostom. They believe that individuals who have more resources have an obligation to support those in need, at times not tending to these duties compared by them as injustice as grave as homicide or theft. Next, the Second Council of Tours, which happened in the 6th century, makes an early reference to the right to stay by saying, quote, "Each and every city should provide its poor and needy inhabitants with sufficient nourishment in accordance with its own ability. Both priests and citizens should take care of feeding the poor in their own region. In this manner, the poor will not have to engage in tiresome traveling and dwell in foreign cities." End of quote. So this is an incredible reference to a very similar idea of a right to stay that the popes in the 20th century have promoted. Then another reference, the 6th century for the care of migrants, is in the decree of Justinian's civil law code, in which the emperor nominates a public official to deal with migrants that arrive at the royal capital of Constantinople. The public official is supposed to make sure that outsiders are employed. Individuals who refuse employment or engage in criminal activity should be expelled from the city. Those who cannot work, though, such as the elderly, the children, and the sick, are to be provided for and treated with dignity. The decree implicitly acknowledged the possibility of welcoming economic migrants looking for jobs, also acknowledged the importance of providing work for those who look for work and supporting those who cannot work. Another legal document that refers to the care for migrants is the Decretum of Gratian. It's a compilation of church canon law in the 12th century. In a part of the text dealing with the requirements for holy orders, one of the requirements is that bishops and priests must be hospitable as one of the main traits for candidates for ordination. Since they, in their ministry, must give example to their congregations, encourage the congregations to show hospitality to strangers and travelers. Welcoming the stranger is so important that it became a legal requirement in this case for priestly ordination itself. So both the Justinian Code and Gratian's Decretum were very influential in shaping the concept of law, justice, and rights in the work of medieval theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, and later on to early modern theologians of the School of Salamanca. I believe that especially these theologians of the School of Salamanca in the 1500s provide a strong evidence for the Catholic Church ethical stance on the care for migrants. Dominican theologians Francisco de Vitoria and Domingo de Soto were the main representatives of this school in the 1500s. They used the concept of what they called the right to travel and dwell to address the mass migration crisis of their time. They argued that for the care of migrants using legal arguments in theology based on scriptures and tradition. This right of migrate that they developed was rooted on several theological ideas, such as the universal destination of goods I mentioned it in the Church Fathers, hospitality, the Lord's command to preach the gospel, the unity of all humans in the body of Christ. Although they argued for a generous care for migrants, they also admit the possibility of regulation of migration in case of crime and in the case of harm for the host community. What makes them special, in my opinion, is that they were the first theologians ever to address the problem of whether people have actually a right to cross international borders. In sum, I believe that these historical witnesses show the importance of care for migrants and provide a compelling argument for Christians of all denominations and all political affiliations in favor of the right to migrate and the right to stay. Now, let us examine the modern history of the right to migrate and stay in Catholic social teaching. It's possible to identify three main theological foundations for these rights that can be discerned in three distinct stages of development. The first stage is marked by the condemnation of forced migration in Pope Leo's the 13 encyclicals, starting with the papal encyclical on the situation of Italian migrants in America, Juan Ramirez of 1888. At this early stage, what drew the Church's attention to migration was its concern for the state of the migrants' moral and spiritual welfare, which tend to suffer once these individuals were separated from their homeland. The salvation of souls is the theological ground for this period. The right to stay is not explicitly formulated at this point, but the roots that will motivate its later formulation are present and the critiques of the Pope against the problems of forced migration. Moreover, in this initial stage, the concern is geared mostly toward the situation of Catholic migrants and not every migrant. Next, there is a second period that starts with Pope Pius XII. While the negative consequences and causes of migration remain in the background, meaning that the right to stay is still not articulated, but it can be understood in the context of the critique to the forced migration. In this stage, the principle of the universal destination of goods is raised by Pope Pius XII as the theological foundation of the right to migrate, especially in the Apostolic Constitution Exo Familia of 1952. But this principle also can be applied, as Pope Pius do, on the case of the right to stay. Finally, there's a a third stage in which the right to stay and the right is explicitly formulated by both Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s and Pope John Paul II in the 1980s. Together with the previous theological grounds, the dignity of the human person now is at the core of the Pope's concern for both the right to stay and the right to migrate. At this final stage, there is a concern for the situation of all migrants, not just Catholics. In sum, these three main theological principles that sustain the right to stay and the right to migrate in the 20th century are salvation of souls, universal destination of goods, and the dignity of the human person. There are other principles, but these three ones are the ones that are most often mentioned by the popes. In conclusion, the right to stay and the right to migrate are present throughout the history of the Church and have emerged as a fundamental principle in modern Catholic social teaching. These rights are rooted in the condemnation of forced migration and its devastating consequences. The explicit formulation of the right to stay, although coming later, has gained significant importance over the years and emphasizes the responsibility of the states and intermediary societies to provide essential resources for human well-being in order to prevent displacement and allow people to freely choose where to stay in their homeland or migrate. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kevin Appleby. I'm with the Center for Migration Studies. I have a PowerPoint that we can put up. I'm talking today about the global compacts. Does everyone know what the global compacts are? They're actually very groundbreaking documents. If we go to I'll just explain what they are. There's a global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, which was, okay, can we go to the slide after the title, please? So it sort of defines what the compacts are. Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. They were both adopted in 2018 in December by the UN General Assembly. They were sort of parallel processes negotiated by the member states over a year and a half, I would say. And the key word in their definitions is they're non-binding, which is a key point. But they do provide a framework for multilateral cooperation on migration governance and on refugee protection. So they're useful tools that can be used certainly for advocacy, but as a sort of a framework, a bellwether for how the world is doing on handling migration situations and protecting refugees. So in my article, what I do is I look at US and Europe, which are the two big receiving nations, and see how they're following the GCM and the GCR and how that honors the right to remain and the right to migrate. So as I mentioned, it's non-binding. What the documents do is provide really policy recommendations for nations to follow. And every 4 years, there's a review process. International Migration Review Mechanism is for the GCM, and they had one in 2022, and they're going to have one in 2026, where they look at the progress that member states have made toward reaching the objectives of the GCM, which has 23 of them. I'm going to focus on 3 or 4 of them, which are most crucial to the right to remain and the right to migrate, and talked a little bit how the US has done on these objectives and how Europe has done on the objectives and what we will see moving forward. As you can see, oops, I'm sorry. Could you go to the next slide, please? Back one more. Yeah. So as you can see, these are the objectives. Objective 2 is minimizing adverse drivers. That's root causes. What are the push factors that are pushing migrants to Europe and US, and how are we addressing them? Objective 5, regular pathways. How have US and Europe increased legal avenues so migrants can migrate legally? Objective 7, reducing vulnerabilities. especially for the undocumented? How can we protect them better? Can we give them legal status? And then the last one is manage borders. How do we manage borders in a way that respects human rights and human dignity? So let me look at how the US has done on this. And we'll go to there we go, thanks. So when I wrote the article, it was at the end of last year, and it covered the Biden administration. Keep in mind that when the GCM was negotiated, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, was not involved. They didn't take part in the negotiations, and the United States didn't vote for the GCM when it was adopted by the UN General Assembly, along with 2 or 3 other nations. So, but when President Biden came in, the administration quickly adopted the GCM. Antony Blinken issued a statement that we will adhere to the GCM and we'll try to implement it. And I must say the Biden administration did a good job of reviving the US policy and trying to promote the GCM. On minimizing adverse drivers, for example, Vice President Harris started the Central American Initiative to look at root causes, raised $5 billion in funds for business startups in the region, and called attention to the fact that people are being driven here, that we have to look at the root causes as part of the whole policy. That's a positive thing. They increased refugee assistance overseas on their Migration Refugee Assistance Account and the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account as well. They did a great job on regular pathways, I must say. Humanitarian parole for many populations. Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan program brought in over 500,000 people. The Ukrainians, 240,000 people on humanitarian parole. And Afghans as well, about 70 to 80,000 at the end of the war. So they used humanitarian parole to allow people to come legally and get legal status. They also, in terms of protecting the dreamers, and they also created these safe mobility offices in Central and South America, which help enable an increase in refugees in our hemisphere for resettlement, which in the past has not been an emphasis. They increased the numbers of those coming from Central and South America through the Refugee Resettlement Program. They also extended TPS to a lot of populations to reduce vulnerabilities. They had a program for deferred action for laborers who were exploited in the workplace, and they increased citizenship approvals. They had a mixed record on the border, to be honest. Some asylum restrictions, certainly at the end of the administration, where the border was shut down at a certain number. The circumvention of legal pathways, which required that people claim asylum in countries of transit. And they deported Haitians to a terrible situation, and Venezuelans as well. So it was a mixed record on the border. But overall, I would give a positive grade to the Biden administration on the GCM and what they did to promote some of the principles there and to preserve the right to remain and the right to migrate. As you all know, though, the new administration is reversing a lot of those gains with all the executive orders that have been issued, shutting down the border, revoking legal status to many of these populations, revoking TPS to Venezuelans and Haitians. All this good work is being reversed. At the conclusion, I think I put down there, is, I think the Trump administration will likely ignore the GCM. I don't know if they'll try to kill it or how they could kill it. There will be an international migration review in 2026. It'll be interesting to see how our government participates in that process, but it certainly won't be supporting the GCM. Europe is a more complicated picture. The EU has negotiated aid packages with African countries, but they have a catch. And if you look at it closely, they're building a virtual wall around Europe. They have bilateral agreements with Northern African countries, with Egypt, with Lebanon, Mauritania, Tunisia, Morocco, and they provide them aid, but they also require that they interdict migrants. So there's a security component there, an enforcement component that is sort of the catch to this aid package that they're doing. So in effect, they're trying to stop migrants from even trying to cross the Mediterranean and reach Europe. And it's starting to have an impact on whether migrants can reach Europe at all. They also have, some of the countries have increased pathways, basically labor pathways, but it's not enough. And it's very difficult for migrants in Africa and other places to really access those programs. So there's an incongruity between what they're doing with enforcement and the legal pathways for people to come, and they need to improve that. On reducing vulnerabilities, they just adopted in April 2024 the European Migration and Asylum Pact, which is a work in progress, really. The next 2 years, they'll be implementing it. But there's been criticism of the pact that it will deprive migrants of due process. It will detain children and families. It sets up sort of a expedited removal process that all the countries will follow. The ostensible purpose of the pact is to share responsibility among all the countries for all the asylum seekers. But there's a nice out that countries that don't want to take asylum seekers can pay the southern nations to detain them and to block them. So there's a lot of concern among the advocacy community as how this will be implemented. And then finally, on managing borders, I mentioned the wall that's being created in Northern Africa and the Middle East to prevent migrants from coming. But there's also concerns about interdictions at sea, pushbacks that countries will intercept ships, take them back to Lampedusa, take them back to Libya, and have not done enough to rescue migrants at sea. In 2023, there were over 3,000 deaths in the Mediterranean, which is a record. Last year was about 700 less, but it was still high. And Europe has received criticism over this, especially including from the Holy Father. And they are trying to take steps to do a better job, especially Greece, which had that terrible shipwreck of about 400 people died in 2023. So that's another area that needs to be improved. I'm probably going over my time. Let me just go quickly through the Global Compact of Refugees because there's better news there. The objectives are to ease pressure on host countries, to enhance refugee reliance, integration, independence in their host countries, expand access to third country solutions, really to expand the countries that are resettling refugees, and to support conditions for return. Those are the four main objectives. So how's the GCR done? How's the US done on the GCR? Again, this is a success story for the Biden administration, an increase in international assistance to refugees. They reestablished the U.S. Refugee and Assistance Program and increased admissions from 11,000 to 100,000. They revitalized the Special Immigrant Visa Program, which is an important program for Afghans and Iraqis as well. At the 2023 Global Refugee Forum, where all the countries come together and NGOs and they make pledges toward refugees, they made 23 pledges, which of course will not now be honored. They expanded humanitarian parole, as I mentioned, to help refugee-like populations. They're focused on refugee-like populations, Ukrainians, Afghans, Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. A quick way to get a lot of people resettled without going through the refugee program. And they were good on developmental assistance. And we're seeing, of course, that the current administration is reversing all those gains with the denial of international assistance and its shutdown of the refugee program. Finally, Europe, a better story for Europe on refugees. They contribute almost 42% of global funding to refugee populations. And Germany and EU were second and third in funding to UNHCR behind the US. US was first. They created an asylum, migration, and integration fund, which is it's like a revolving fund that they keep funded to help with resettlement and relocation, integration, and safe return operations for refugees. And they've done a good job on developmental assistance as well. They announced at the forum that they were going to have 61,000 resettlement slots for the EU in 24-25. So what does this all mean? Where is this going to go? Certainly, with a new administration in the US, the future is not clear as to how the GCM and GCR will be implemented worldwide. What we're seeing is Europe is slowly closing their doors to asylum seekers. I forgot to mention, they announced just this last week new procedures for deportations, sending people to return hubs in third countries, sort of like what the Trump administration is doing as well. So that was just announced last week. So Europe is slowly denying asylum over time to asylum seekers, and this is very troubling. So on the resettlement side, Europe is going to have to stand up even more than 61,000 to really make up for the US decreasing their resettlement capacity. UNHCR that said that this year they need a 25% increase in resettlement from 2024, and I don't know if they're going to be able to match that. One thing we have to keep in mind is the right to remain and the right to migrate are still important principles in both of these compacts, and they need to still be the standard bearer for how people are doing, how nations are performing under the compacts, and whether the goals of the compacts are being realized. So in our advocacy, we need to use these two compacts as a tool, not only to keep our own government's feet to the fire, but Europe and other countries as well. My article can be found at CMSNY.org. Thank you.
Maria, are you there? I think we have a PowerPoint here too. Hi, Maria. You're up.
Thank you. Hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you, Don. Thank you to the Jesuit Refugee Service and for the Center for Migration Studies for this invitation and also for the work you have done in Colombia. So it's very nice for me, and it's an honor to have the possibility to share with you how these migration issues are reflected in Colombia and the inseparably tie that it is to the right to peace in our country. So I thank you also for sharing the PowerPoint, and we can go to the next slide, please. I will just would like to mention 3 topics. First of all, just give some facts and figures on Colombia, its armed conflict and migration issues. Then the reasons to migrate and the possible solutions tied to peace building in Colombia. And finally, some lessons learned and recommendations for non-recurrence. So on the first topic, some facts and figures just for us to give a context to this presentation. We're speaking about Colombia, South America, a country with over 60 years of armed confrontation, more than 9 million of victims, and 80% of those victims are civilians who have been caught between the armed actors. And we have signed a very comprehensive peace agreement in the year 2016, but we are all clear, and that's why this peace agreement is so comprehensive, that beyond peacemaking, beyond stopping the fight between the government and the FARC guerrillas, this peace agreement was related to this guerrilla, we need a profound structural and cultural transformation in Colombia in order to seek peace. And we are struggling to move forward with it, but we, at least right now, realize that not only having the guerrillas is the problem, and that the solution is not only demobilizing all these people, but also that we need profound cultural and structural changes. So that's on the side of our armed conflict and violent situation in Colombia. And when we deep into the topic of migration, there are 3 elements that Don mentioned initially that are very important to understand in our country. Within these 60 years of armed confrontation, the most important violation and victimization in Colombia are IDPs, internal displaced persons. We have almost or over 8 million persons that have been internally displaced because of the armed confrontation within the country. But in the last 2 years, after the report of the Colombian Truth Commission, where I had the possibility to work, Colombia had realized that after internal displacement, exile is the next biggest violation and victimization issue in Colombia. We have in the last 40 years almost 1 million of Colombians who left the country because of the armed, to mention some issues and elements that were very important in the work of the Truth Commission. So the first of it is that on average, all the persons who flee from Colombia, who went into exile, they, on average, they decided to go into exile after the fourth threatened situation that they have already lived. So it is important to know that the people are not just waiting to leave the country, but they tried and they faced 4 difficult, violent situations before, maybe internal displacement, maybe a child being recruited, maybe a family member being killed. This leaves very important psychosocial consequences of uprooting loneliness and vulnerability for these populations, which also demands and requires special protection and accompanying measures whenever they leave the country. And
Maria, you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if that's on our end or your end, but maybe if you could talk closer to the mic or. She has to reconnect.
hearing me?
Yeah, now we can. Yep. Go ahead.
I'm back. I will just turn my camera off.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I was speaking about the issue. Okay, I will try to catch up again.
I would just keep going. You're still breaking up just a little bit though. What should she be doing, folks? Any? Yep. Could you try to sign back in, Maria? Because we're not hearing you at all right now.
Is it working now? No?
Yes. Yep.
I'm back. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so returning to the previous slide, I was mentioning this issue that people decided to leave after 4 threats that they have had before. Another element that is very important in this Colombian situation is that all armed actors involved in the armed conflict have been responsible for exile. And also that all sectors in Colombian society have been affected by exile. We have syndicalists, we have human rights defenders, we have judges, we have business people, we have journalists, all these people that have had to leave Colombia because of threats to life. Finally, also that exile is directly related to impunity because of 2 elements. The first one, because when the victims go away, the process, judicial processes most of the time stop, but also in many cases because it has been the judges who leave the country because they are in threat because of the investigations that they are doing. And then finally, also in terms of migration, what we have experienced since 2018, very high, or 17 in Colombia, is the immigrants, most of them coming from Venezuela. So we have this double situation, or triple situation where we have internally displaced persons, we have persons leaving the country because of the armed conflict, but also we have experienced in the last years a huge amount of immigrants coming to Colombia, most of them from Venezuela. We can do the next slide. So here is where we, if we could go to the next slide, please. Because the Colombian Truth Commission has identified 7 topics or 7 issues why Colombians leave the country. Out of these 7 issues, in order of priority of what they have mentioned, we can see that there is a direct relation to the
I think, Maria, we can't hear you, so maybe would it just make sense to walk through the PowerPoint, and then if somehow Maria is able to connect again, we can pick up where. Yeah. So you all can read that too, but you want to just testing whether I can read or not. So recommendations for non-recurrence to the international community, and civil society in Colombia, to the UN Security Council. And this is an example of a great writer for the Journal on Migration and Human Security, because she's making recommendations actually to particular bodies that would change things and could change things. And then finally to the Colombian state. And of course, like what's going on here is that central in this presentation to the right to stay is the maintenance of a really fragile peace process. And these are recommendations related to non-recurrence. A huge number of kind of victims that are around. If we were to honor each of our victims with a moment of silence, that's very powerful. Okay, I think that's it. Maria, you're not back, are you?
I am. Thank you. I'm so sorry for this internet connection. Thank you so much for finishing the presentation, Don, and for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm not you though. That's the thing. But you're great, and thank you for your great work in life too, Maria. It's great to hear from you. So Michael Petro is our next speaker. He's a Jesuit who runs a migrant center in Lebanon, which is a very complicated place to be working these days. And Michael, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Excellent.
The
floor is yours.
Great. I'm going to try to share my screen here. We'll see if this works. If it doesn't, that is okay. Let's see.
We can see you. You can see the screen and the PowerPoint.
There we go. Great. Okay. All right. So I'll close this out today by asking what work for this human freedom to stay or to migrate looks like in a context of overlapping and multiple migrations. Here in Lebanon, nationals face pressure to leave. Migrant workers, I think the connection I have with the PowerPoint is not super great, so we'll forego the PowerPoint. Nationals face a lot of pressure to leave. Refugees who'd like to stay in Lebanon must leave or must stay, depending on their situation. And many migrant workers have come here temporarily, leaving their homes so that others may stay in other countries. Although we're discussing the freedom to choose whether to stay or to migrate, I'll focus more, given the context here in Lebanon, on the right to stay, which we'll soon see is very complicated here on the ground. I'll draw on examples from JRS's work with Syrian refugees, from Lebanese locals, and migrant domestic workers in Lebanon to look at these questions. First, does a right to stay make sense for everyone in Lebanon? And if so, how, under what formulation? And second, when you understand the right to stay is primarily connected with dignity, what does that mean for humanitarian rather than development work? Usually when people think of migration in Lebanon, they jump straight to the situation of Syrian refugees, which is catastrophic, right? Since the start of the civil war in Syria over a decade ago, over 1.5 million Syrians have moved into Lebanon, a country with a population of around 4.5 million. And as you can imagine, the United States having another 100 million refugees. I think that would give you a sense of the scale here. For many, it was a destination of necessity rather than desire. People did not necessarily want to come to Lebanon, but this was where they could go. The Lebanese government does not officially recognize Syrians as refugees, despite the very large UNHCR apparatus here, and refuses even to use the word refugee, najin, in Arabic. It's a difficult situation. Over 80% of Syrians cannot meet basic living standards. Most children do not attend school, and child labor and early marriage are widespread. Resettlement is a distant but hard to abandon hope for many Syrians here in Lebanon. In a context where many refugees broadly do not really want to stay, does it make sense to speak of their right to stay here in Lebanon? I'll argue that for JRS, for our work here, it does make sense to speak about that right, but only when you see it in a very particular way. Oftentimes, I think in academic discussions on the right to stay, we look to a couple different sources. Those discussions will reflect the connections that a person, a migrant, might form with their home, right, the place they're from, or with the place they adopt. Those would be called either life plan or attachment-based forms of the right to stay. The problem with these visions, as the political theorist Valerio Tonelli notes, is that migrants' claims to the right become weakest in exactly the places where they are most vulnerable. That is, where it is hard or impossible to build compelling life plans or meaningful connections in the place where one actually lives. Rather than focusing on refugees' relationships to Lebanon, to the state here, or to the country here, JRS draws on a practical vision of the right to stay as a control right, right? So it's rooted in dignity and in privacy. In this understanding, a subject's chosen place of residence becomes, I think it's reflective of the boundaries of privacy that are integral to the self. Forced displacement deals a specific harm because it violates that control. It violates the intimate domain of control that the subject relies on to form their self. This framing of the right gives us a specific sense of what is at stake for individuals and Pope Francis's vision for migration that is based on the individual freedom to choose whether to migrate or to stay. What does this mean for us in practice in our work on the ground? I'll focus on our efforts in a particular neighborhood of the Beirut area called Borj Hamoud, which is a traditionally Armenian neighborhood, so another history of genocide and of refuge, but now hosts to large Lebanese low-income populations, Syrian refugee groups, and migrants from all over the world. You can buy anything, eat anything in Borj Hamoud. It's a very dynamic place. For JRS, this understanding of the right to stay leads us to a focus on dignity in our work in Borj Hamoud. In practice, this means building programs in our center there that build migrants' agency and control and create spaces of safety and healing in a context where that dignity is otherwise violated. First, we provide education for refugee children. We provide in our schools physically secure spaces that are welcoming, inviting, with staff that invite students to feel at home and in control in our space. We're trying to restore some of the loss of intimate boundary creation for children. Through case management work and mental health, our staff address the wounds and difficulties that refugees have experienced in their flight to and life in Lebanon, working on how to manage the stress of life here and working to heal insofar as possible from some of that stress. Our education programming in Borj Hamoud helps children prepare to go to school in the national or private systems and helps them to build agency through education. And so these are the three pillars of our work on the right to stay for Syrians here in Lebanon: intimate control, healing, and agency. The argument that I'm making here is that the refugee's right to stay has practical effects on humanitarian work, even when that right is not legally guaranteed in the case of Lebanon, and when the person in question may not ultimately desire to actually stay here, right? The right still gives us clear pathways for work to support the underlying human dignity that's at stake with the right to stay. If this is the what, right, intimate control, healing, and agency, then there are still some important lessons in how, right, how we do this kind of work from Lebanon's complicated context. For JRS, the principles that undergird our response to Syrian refugees meant that we couldn't ignore the growing pressures on Lebanese people that encourage them to leave Lebanon. Right now, if you ask, maybe 1 of every 2 Lebanese youth are thinking of leaving Lebanon, and that's been a trend for a long time. Lebanon is one of the largest diaspora communities in the world. In the same neighborhood, the needs between Lebanese and Syrian people are often quite similar. In Borshemoud, we see this every day. But serving both populations is not as simple as basic inclusion. Although we've been working in Borshemoud for over a decade, a couple years ago when we were redesigning our project, there was a wave of anti-Syrian sentiment, this is about in 2023, that put our ability to operate in serious jeopardy. Because we were committed to serving both populations, we had to follow a method that was attentive to the interactions between the pressures that forced Lebanese to leave and Syrians to stay, to see how that leaving and staying interacts, and ultimately required us to limit the scope of our engagement. I think a good example of this method is our work on trash, or more accurately, our lack of work on trash. With the collapse of government services in Lebanon, many community leaders had flagged work in waste management as trash, as a shared concern in the neighborhood that JRS might actually be able to help address. But after a bit of research, our team found that locals and refugees relate to the issue in vastly different ways that actually come into tension with each other. It is mostly refugees in Borshemoud who are willing to work in the informal trash collection and recycling industries who bear the brunt of that difficulty, while locals frequently associate the collapse of the waste management system with the arrival of Syrians, right? Those happened at about the same time in Lebanon. So trash has become a potent symbol of why, for many, Lebanese need to leave and how Syrians are making it worse, right? So it's an issue that we can't touch. So we left it. Right? It was a place where we could have worked. It was a place where we could have made a difference. But it was at the core of this sense of difficulty between Syrians staying and Lebanese leaving that made it too difficult for us to touch. So although dignity-focused programming meant that we needed to attend to all of those in our area whose right to stay was under threat, the reality of multiple migrations means that our work needs to be careful. We can't do everything for everybody. And we need to attend to how the pressures that drive each of those independent migrations interact in the same place. I'll close with the part of our work that's closest to me, JRS's accompaniment of migrant domestic workers, and how their situation complicates even more thinking on the right to stay. Lebanon hosts just about 200,000, a little bit under 200,000 migrant domestic workers, chiefly from Africa, South Asia, and the Philippines. When I say Africa, I mean everywhere, Nigeria to Madagascar and everywhere in between. They come for domestic work, mostly, but also some working in agricultural or manufacturing industries. But all are subject to Lebanon's kafala system, which links the employee's right to residency to the specific person of their employer, as well as almost all other rights, labor or otherwise. They're dependent on a poorly enforced civil contract. It's often likened to slavery, and for many of the people that we know who live it, I think that's a very valid comparison. What's important for this conversation on the right to stay is that migrant workers often express their hopes for their future in terms that are mobile and elsewhere, right? Not here in Lebanon, in their home country or otherwise. That is, they very rarely intend to actually stay here in Lebanon, and they certainly haven't stayed where they're in the country they're from. The most important parts of their lives, their children, their parents, their spouses, are elsewhere, and they have left so that others may stay. In academic work on the right to stay, there's a sort of sense, and this is, I think, true in a lot of migration scholarship, that it is best not to leave, what some scholars refer to as sedentary bias. But the reality for many of the people here is that they left and came here because migration can bring, or often does bring, benefits for many of the people they left behind. During the war in the fall, in which we were running emergency shelters for migrant domestic workers, we were able to help many women from Sierra Leone particularly get back home to their home country and escape the war here. But I'll never forget many of the conversations I was having with women on the last night of their stay here, in which a couple of them came to the conclusion that they had to stay. They couldn't get on that flight tomorrow because they had children, they had parents, elderly relatives, sick relatives who were depending on them, counting on their remittances in Sierra Leone. They would have to go home later. But what does the work for the right to stay here in Lebanon look for them, right? When they're stuck here, but envisioning their future elsewhere and planning eventually on returning. They have planned mobilities. In the case of migrant workers, supporting control and agency means acknowledging that planned mobility, as well as reckoning with its delayed character. Our work here is not one of integration, right? Although welcome is very important, migrant workers are not trying to integrate in Lebanon. And trying to help migrant workers enter Lebanese society is not one of our primary goals. Rather, our work focuses on protecting their ability to stay here safely, to leave when they desire, and to create space for their own agency, supporting the connections here and abroad that they find useful for their own plans, both here and in their home country. A good way of showcasing this would be the cricket league that we host through our Jesuit network. Led by Sri Lankan migrants, the league includes now over 20 teams, men and women, who gather for weekly play and periodic tournaments in the parking lot of our center. With over 200 participants, the league provides largely South Asian, but now some Filipino migrants, a connection to their home culture while living here in Lebanon. The league fosters, I think this is important, a strong network of mutual support that is both here and connected to their home countries. In recent months, players channeled resources from Sri Lanka to assist a critically injured child here and sent funds back to support another family in crisis there. National embassies sponsor tournaments and field teams, promote awareness of services, as well as a connection to their home countries. The league strengthens migrants' cultural links to home, builds transnational networks for support, and even helps engagement with home governments. So instead of pursuing agendas of integration or other frameworks that prioritize stability, our programs with migrant workers try to create space for migrant agency, supporting connections they find useful to their own plans, wherever they are. Ultimately, engaging the reality of migrant workers' mobility enables responses that both foster their dignity and freedom and enables them to pursue goals wherever they are, right? So to foster their agency to stay or to leave. Ultimately, our mission of accompaniment, JRS's mission of accompaniment here in Lebanon, focuses on supporting freedom through building agency, protecting control and dignity, and offers spaces of healing for those who've had that dignity violated. In all, our framework requires broad and inclusive response that reckons with the complexities of actual mobility, temporary or long-term, as they are actually lived. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions here, and I think we're going to take a couple from the audience, the very large audience, both here, but more so on the joining us remotely. But any questions for?
Hi, I'm Christian Sunan from Georgetown University. I have a question for Antonio. You talked about how early church teaching around the right to stay or the right to migrate focused a lot on the principle of the universal destination of goods, and that especially the last three popes have shifted focus, especially on human dignity as the principle behind migration teaching. Seeing as so much of the resistance to migration in the United States has a very material focus on stealing jobs, taking resources from social programs, that sort of thing. I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for a development of or return to discussion about the universal destination of goods as a backing for a support for the right to migrate or the right to stay? And then secondly, is there maybe an element of discussions around human dignity that focuses on the radical egalitarianism that it implies that might become a bigger part of the public discourse in the Catholic world?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. I do think we the universal destination good is such a fundamental principle for the right to migrate, right? As you mentioned, all the way the fathers of the church were mentioning, is the principle that connected right to migrate throughout the whole history of Catholic theology. Another interesting thing too is that Pope Pius XII is the first one of the modern popes to explicitly mentioned a right to migrate in 1942 in a radio message, and later in 1952 he reinforced that in the Exo Familia. And he talks about the right to migrate as a natural right. Is actually the only pope who very direct thinks that the right to migrate is a natural right, and the main thing for him is that that's a natural right because it's grounded on the universal destination of goods. So yeah, as you are right, we should go back to that to understand the importance, because when we're talking about national rights, we're talking about natural rights. We're talking about rights that go beyond local civil law, and should be respected for any local legislations. So that's another reason why we should look towards it. Thank you.
Others? Questions from the audience? None? Okay. Yes.
Hi, my question is for Kevin. My name is Madeleine Elhabal. I'm with Catholic News Agency.
Hi, Madeleine.
So my question is, and I guess to sort of bridge the gap between the two kind of battling forces here in the US, you spoke about refugee programs in Europe and the Global Compact, et cetera. This new administration is here because they were elected by a majority who wanted this this different reform. And I'm just wondering, is there a way that the church can interact with this administration effectively in recognizing the changes that they propose, while also affirming human dignity and being able to maybe propose a different system for migrants that's different from the UN?
Well, I always believe that dialogue is important. And I just wrote an article for America Magazine where I pointed out 4 areas where the church and the administration might find some common ground in principle. Human trafficking, for example, maybe the helping get a deal with on the Dreamers being one, trying to get refugees resettled again. These and I was in the comments to my article, I was criticized as being naive, and I was going to put a line in there saying suspend disbelief here, but I don't think the church, and it's not the church's fault, should wait for 4 years. We have to try to engage the administration as much as possible, because by doing that, you can help refugees. You might be able to help migrants in some capacity, whereas if we're at odds, always at odds, that might not be the case. So that's how I would approach it. And hopefully as time goes on, there'll be an engagement, and we might see some progress. Hope springs eternal. But I think it's a both and, really. I mean, the church needs to speak out where they need to speak out to defend migrants, but they also should have some sort of engagement with the Trump administration about, okay, where could we work together here? Let's cease fire for a while.
I mean, maybe I'll just riff for a second here. Why I think that this is a very, very important time to talk about this vision is because it's a powerful vision, and it reflects, the dignity, the agency, and even we heard the word healing that needs to take place. It's a person-centered vision that recognizes migrants as agents and decision makers in their own lives. In other words, it recognizes them as in fact they are, and that we don't emphasize that enough in our public debates. It also holds states responsible for various things, to allow people to stay, to allow desperate people to migrate safely, to help to find permanent solutions for them. That's not at odds or incompatible with border enforcement that's humane and effective, but it's not language that we're hearing much of these days. And I think it's very, in reading, being privileged to read these articles and their development, it's very good language that can speak at every stage of the migration process and that can speak to very complex and different kinds of migration situations, as in Colombia, as in Lebanon, or whatever. I was very taken with Michael's observation that, you know, some leave so others can stay. That's a very person-centered view because all migrants are different and individuals in this. Like the Sierra Leonean women, you know, who could have escaped, you know, the violence, I mean, real violence, real threats against them. They're not looking to integrate, but what he said was they are looking to stay. And what's important for JRS in this work is creating agency so that they can do that. So this focus again on agency, dignity, and the like, I think is extraordinarily important. And I think where we start maybe with the situation that we're in right now is we start with our vision. And we understand our vision, and we understand Catholic teaching. And that's really kind of the purpose of today. And we had beautiful examples of that kind of this morning. And I think the panel and these terrific articles and the great thinking that's gone on are a part of that as well. I'm going to stop there. I am going to ask you all, if you want to stand up and stretch, please do, but please don't go out and eat yet because we have a really terrific speech or speaker right now who's also I'm privileged to call kind of a friend of mine. And you can read, I think it's probably somewhere in the materials, Juan Sebastian Chamorro's biography. I'd really encourage you to do that. I know Juan, we were actually neighbors at this last year, and we would meet in kind of a common laundry room sometimes even to chat. But I know him personally as a very strong family man, an accomplished economist, a political dissident, a staunch pro-democracy activist, a very insightful author, and he's got a major book coming out soon. A courageous person that was imprisoned for his convictions. Once a stateless person, no longer, thank God. Once a refugee. And above all, and I've heard him speak many, many times, a man who's really sustained through all of this by his strong faith. So we're delighted to have Juan Chamorro here as one of our keynote speakers today, and I thank him for joining us. And please do come up. And thanks to panelists for this last presentation.